8 or 12 hours. One of the things that I like to say, which we see occurring, is you have Patch Tuesday. Right, the second Tuesday of every month, Microsoft comes out with their patches. You see Patch Tuesday and Exploit Thursday. Why? Because what happens? Microsoft releases all their patches. What is a patch? A vulnerability. A patch is fixing a vulnerability in the software. So when a vendor comes out with a patch, they're telling the whole world, here are vulnerabilities in our software. So what do the attackers do? They spend Tuesday evening and Wednesday reverse engineering the patch, figuring out what the vulnerability is. They then go in and write exploit code, and then Thursday they start exploiting into systems. Which means if you don't patch your box within 48 hours, there's a good chance by the time you patch it, the fox is already in the hen house. So what we need to do is, instead of doing threat-based security, we need to do this paradigm shift where we go in and do vulnerability-based. We identify our weaknesses and we fix them. By going in and identifying our weaknesses and fixing them, what are we now doing? We're doing proactive security. Because I'm finding a weakness and I'm fixing it before an attacker comes along. So by the time a threat manifests itself, the vulnerability is already fixed and I'm staying one step ahead of the attacker. The other nice thing about vulnerability-based security is many threats take advantage of the same vulnerability. So if I'm constantly reacting to the threats, I might be going in and taking action on 15 different threats. Yet if all 15 of those threats are taking advantage of the same weakness or vulnerability, if I fix that one vulnerability, all 15 of those threats go away or disappear. So that's one of the big paradigm shifts I'm seeing, where we need to go in and change our mindset of how we're approaching security and start being more proactive as opposed to reactive. This is one of the debates I get into periodically, which is, can you prevent zero-day attacks or unknown or unpublished attacks? And I say absolutely. People are like, no way. If you don't know about it, how can you prevent it? That's a threat-based mindset. If you don't know the threat, how can you fix it? Here's my example. If I have a web server and it's running port 80, 443, which is HTTP and SSL, and it's also running port 25, what if I go in and say a web server should not be running mail, especially on a DMZ, you should separate it out. So what we do is we turn off that service, which therefore closes the port, so now it's no longer open. Now if a zero-day exploit on port 25 sendmail comes out and my port is closed, didn't I just go in and prevent that exploit? Absolutely. I didn't know I was doing it, but I was still able to go in and turn that off because it's real simple. If we're talking about external attacks, people make it a lot more complicated than it needs to be. If I'm going in from the internet and breaking into your system externally, there's 4 conditions that need to occur. First, your system needs to be visible. You need to have a public address that somebody can see and get access to. Therefore, if your system has a private address and is not publicly accessible, if I can't get to your system, I can't exploit it. That's one of those ones. I'm actually finishing up a paper right now on the new security issues presented with IPv6. Everybody's going in and talking about how IPv6 is solving all these problems and doing all these great things, but it's also opening up a new series of issues and problems. Even though private addresses and network address translation was never meant as a security feature, if somebody can't see your IP address, they can't break in. Well, IPv6, the address space is so large, there are no private addresses. Everything's a public address. So now you're relying on the fact that people are probably filtering those public IPs correctly. Which, if history is any indication of the future, I can guarantee you that many companies are going to make mistakes with that. So first is visibility. Second is, if once I see your system, if I need to break in, I need to connect to your system. And how do I do that? Via a port. The more ports that are open, the more points of exploitation. You shut down ports, you shut down the visibility. Once I connect to a port, what am I connecting to? A service. So therefore, you have a service running on the back end of the system. And therefore, what do I do when I exploit your system? I find a vulnerability in that service. If the service is not vulnerable, I can't get in. If the service is vulnerable, I can. So if we go in and look at protecting and preventing external attacks from occurring, you limit visibility, you close ports, and you turn off unnecessary components and services. And yes, I am oversimplifying it, but it really is that easy in terms of scalability. The problem is if you have 50,000 systems, that's where it starts to get fairly complex. One of my friends came up to me and said, Eric, I keep getting speeding tickets. This is so frustrating. Every time I drive, I get a speeding ticket. It just seems impossible. The cops are out to get me. I just can't go anywhere without getting a ticket. And I said, you know something? There's sort of a simple solution to this. Really? Tell me. It's called the speed limit. They post it on every road. They tell you what the rules are. My friend was acting like it's some magical formula that you have to fill out on the fly like a differential equation problem in order to figure out whether you're going to get a speeding ticket or not. No, it's pretty simple. Look at the sign on the side of the road and make sure your speedometer needle is less than the number on the sign. If you follow the speed limit, you won't get a speeding ticket. It's the rules of the road. They're clearly published. The problem is, if you speed all the time and you're a reckless driver and you always go over the speed limit, you have many bad habits. So trying to break those bad habits is really, really difficult. And that's what happens with a lot of organizations and corporations is they've done things in a bad way for so long, it's very hard to break those habits. Once again, based on what I just talked about with external attacks, I actually developed a very straightforward network architecture that if you follow these 3 rules, the chances of your system getting broken into is greatly reduced, and the chances of sensitive data being exploited is reduced. And I've used these 3 rules for a company that has 50 employees, and I've done it for large government organizations that had 500,000 employees. And what it comes down to is you start with a basic 3-tier architecture. You have your DMZ, you have your middleware, and you have your private network. The way it works is people from the internet can only get to your DMZ. The DMZ can only get to the middleware, and the middleware can only get to your private interface. So that's the first setup. Go in and set up a 3-tier architecture where the middleware bridges the gap. Then any system on your DMZ is accessible from the internet. So if a system doesn't need to be accessible from the internet, don't put it on your DMZ. If it does need to be accessible from the internet, you put it on your DMZ following one caveat. You assume it's compromisable. You assume that anything on that DMZ can be compromised. Because the trick with security, if you assume worst case scenario, if it occurs, you're well prepared. If it doesn't occur, it's better than you thought and you're still in good shape. So you assume anything on your DMZ is compromisable. No sensitive data on your DMZ. Anything with sensitive data goes on your private network, and anything on your private network is not accessible from the internet. You follow those rules, they scale to organizations of any size, and you've just gone in and followed the rules of the road to prevent most of the major attacks from occurring. Now the problem is this. I have a mail server. My mail server needs to be accessible from the internet so I can get inbound and outbound email from the internet. So what do most organizations do? They put the email server on their private network and they allow it to be accessible from the internet, and then they're shocked and surprised when they get broken into. But wait a second, Eric. I can't put my mail server on the DMZ because it has sensitive data that's not compromisable. But if I put it on my internal private network and it can't be accessible from the internet, then how do I get mail? Very simple. I put a mail front end on my DMZ. I then go in and put a mail sandbox program like an iron port on my middleware, and then I put my mail server on my private network. Now, my mail server is visible from the internet, but if it's compromised, there's really nothing stored there. That's the front-end interface. It then goes to the middleware server. It gets scanned and filtered, and then it gets forwarded to your back-end private server. And then the last rule is, if that's not good enough, add additional tiers. Add a 4th or a 5th level tier between your DMZ and your private network. Now, am I saying if you do that, it's going to be guaranteed that you don't get broken into? No. That's like guaranteeing that you're not going to get into a car accident or guaranteeing you're not going to die. There's no guarantees.